South Africa's navy was very modest compared to the navies of other Commonwealth countries, such as Australia and Canada. However, one South African ship did achieve a remarkable record, a notable first in the war. That ship was HMSAS Natal, and we thought its story was one worth telling in this video. HMSAS Natal was a Loch-class frigate built by Swan Hunter and Wigham Richardson Limited in Wallsend-on-Tyne in northeastern England, which is a mere 4 miles or 6 kilometers from the city of Newcastle. She was 307 feet, or just over 93 meters in length, and 38 feet 7 inches, or 11.8 meters across her beam. She was powered by 2 Admiralty 3-drum boilers with propulsion afforded by 2 vertical triple-expansion steam engines. She could attain a top speed of 20 knots, equating to 23 miles or 37 kilometers per hour. The ship was built late in the war, having been ordered on February 13, 1943, then laid down on October 18 of that year, and finally launched 6 months later on June 19, 1944. She was initially named HMS Loch-class and intended for use in Britain's Royal Navy. She undertook her trials over a few months with that name. HMS Loch-class was officially handed over to the South African Navy on March 1, 1945, amounting to mere months from the end of the Second World War. She'd be rechristened 8 days later as HMSAS Natal, with HMSAS standing for His Majesty's South African Ship, and Natal being one of the 4 provinces of the Union of South Africa at the time. Her commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander David Alfred Hall of the South African Navy. Hall put in a request with the Royal Navy's High Command that his crew be given 2 more days with the new ship. He wanted his crew to be as well familiarized with it as possible, especially given that the South African sailors had only previously worked on trawlers and whale ships which had been converted for the war into minesweepers and auxiliary vessels. All of his sailors were volunteers with scant military experience. What they were familiar with in South Africa were far smaller vessels than the new British frigate. His request was granted, and HMSAS Natal finally sailed from the River Tyne at around 9 a.m. on March 14, 1945. Its destination was Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands off Scotland's northeast coast. After that, she would proceed to the anti-submarine training base at Tobermory on the Isle of Mull off the west coast of Scotland. Little did the inexperienced crew of South African officers and sailors on board HMSAS Natal know that they would make history just 4 hours after leaving port for their first working up. The crew was still getting to grips with their new ship when an urgent signal came in. This was off the east coast of Scotland, and HMSAS Natal was making its way north to Scapa Flow. The Sheaf Crown, a southbound vessel, signaled that a merchant ship had just been torpedoed and sunk nearby. It would later be revealed that the sunken vessel was a Swedish cargo ship, the Maiden. The position of that sinking provided by the Sheaf Crown indicated it had occurred close to the fishing harbor of St. Abbs near the Firth of Forth. That was a mere 5 miles to the north of HMSAS Natal's current position. The South African frigate arrived in the area to find 11 survivors of the sunken Swedish vessel bobbing around in the North Sea. The South African crew immediately started rescuing the survivors from the sea. Also on the scene was HMS Wyvern, a V&W-class destroyer and veteran of the Royal Navy. As all of this was going on, the South African frigate made a positive detection of a submarine off her port beam, more specifically a German U-boat. The detection was possible courtesy of new scanning equipment known as Sword ASDIC scanner, or more specifically, SET 147B. This particular scanner allowed for both vertical and lateral fixes on objects in the water. ASDIC itself stood for Anti-Submarine Detection, although the British Admiralty had claimed in 1939 that it stood for Allied Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, but that's debatable. Whatever the meaning of the acronym, HMAS was a submarine detection system using sophisticated sonar technology that had been further developed by British, French, and American scientists during World War II. HMAS technology had been around since 1916, but it was during World War II that it really came into its own. To say that HMAS technology was a game-changer in the Battle of the Atlantic from 1943 onwards is an understatement. Another feature of the Loch-class frigate is that it was also armed with a Squid. This was a top-secret weapon of its time that used depth-charge mortars to fire ahead. It could fire 2 salvos of 6 mortars each with devastating effect. This was fired by HMSAS Natal directly in the direction of where the U-boat had been detected by the HMAS. Suddenly, a huge patch of light diesel oil appeared on the surface of the sea as well as pieces of wreckage. More mortar attacks by the South African ship continued. This was followed by more oil and a metal tank breaking the surface. By then it was assumed that the U-boat had gone straight down to the bottom of the North Sea. The U-boat in question was U-714, which had been built by H.C. Stulken in Hamburg and commissioned on February 10, 1943. During her 2 years of operation, U-714 had been on 6 patrols, having sunk just 2 ships, one of which was the aforementioned Swedish cargo ship, the other a minor Norwegian auxiliary warship. She had been part of 6 U-boat wolf packs between October 1943 and February 1944. The U-boat was with the 33rd U-boat flotilla on the day that she was struck by HMSAS Natal. 50 men lost their lives when U-714 went down. Definitive confirmation of the U-boat hit was done later. A Royal Navy hunter-killer group had been sent north from the Tyne, led by HMS Ascension. This group had depth charge blasted the entire seabed at the exact location of where the attack had occurred. That blasting brought up a significant quantity of debris to the surface, all of which was clearly from a German U-boat. Floating among the debris was a hand-carved shield depicting a diving U-boat. The shield was sent to HMSAS Natal as a memento of its momentous achievement. That hit by HMSAS Natal on March 14, 1945, would set the record for the entire war as the fastest sinking of another vessel by a warship on its maiden patrol. 4 hours is all took before the South African vessel sank a U-boat. Within a very short time, the officers of HMS Wyvern were claiming that their ship also deserved a share of the U-boat hit. They made that assertion on the basis of a depth charge attack, made later that same day by HMS Wyvern on an oil slick about 10 miles or 15 kilometers to the south of where HMSAS Natal had sunk U-714. It was a rather ludicrous assertion, but the British crew vigorously made it nevertheless. However, their account was soon turned down by British naval authorities. It was found that there was no way that the British destroyer could have made ASDIC contact with the submerged U-boat, given that HMS Wyvern's equipment was very outdated. Furthermore, the so-called depth charge attack by the Wyvern on an oil slick later that day produced no debris whatsoever. All the recognized authorities have credited HMSAS Natal solely with this successful attack. Let's be frank, it must have irked the larger British destroyer and its more professional crew like mad to have been beaten by a smaller frigate crewed by a bunch of South African volunteers, and, to make matters worse, a frigate that had just left port on its first mission just 4 hours earlier. Nothing irks like an imperial power being bested by a colonial underling. Instead, the British Admiralty asserted the tremendous achievement of HMSAS Natal and its crew so soon after commissioning. The British Navy would describe the event as unique in the annals of the Royal Navy. The frigate would go on to be awarded a Royal Navy Battle Honor and a number of individual decorations. HMSAS Natal, as part of the Royal Navy's 8th Escort Group, would continue to have an active role in the last months of the infamous Battle of the Atlantic. She would then be diverted to the Far East, where she took part in Operation Zipper. which was the reoccupation by the Allies of Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies from Japanese occupation. After the war, she had a long and distinguished career, including transporting South African soldiers back from Egypt and even being adopted by the province of Natal in July 1945. She would go on to participate as a hydrographic survey ship in various expeditions in the Indian Ocean in the 1950s and 1960s. She even took part in the annexation by South Africa of Marion Island and Prince Edward Island in the subarctic Indian Ocean in late 1947, islands that belong to the country to this day. Finally, on the 19th of September 1972, HMSAS Natal was towed south of Cape Point, the southernmost tip of Africa, where she was sunk as a gunnery target. It seemed a rather callous end to a ship with such a proud pedigree.